It begins like a false alarm. Somewhere on a hospital ward in northern England, a receptionist clicks to open a patient file and the screen freezes. A red and black window blooms like a bruise over the desktop. Oops, your files have been encrypted. Alarms don't actually sound, but down the hall a surgery scheduling system fails to load, lab results stall in transit, and a triage nurse starts handwriting notes because printers won't respond. At the same time, an engineer in Madrid watches an internal monitoring board turn red as file shares across a telecoms network wink offline. Thousands of miles away, in an office park in Asia, someone watches a digital ransom note demand a few $100s worth of Bitcoin with the confidence of a robber who already knows every exit has been sealed. At first, the incidents seem disconnected. Isolated failures, flaky Windows machines, a routine IT headache. But in minutes, then hours, the pattern becomes unmistakable. It's a worm and it's moving fast. It does not need your click to spread. It does not care who you are. It is hunting something older and deeper than any single application. The plumbing that lets computers talk to each other inside almost every business on Earth. As the morning turns to afternoon, the wave becomes a wall. Trains display ransom notes on station monitors. Car factories pause their lines. Government offices revert to pen and paper. Doctors cancel operations. The world is learning a new name the hard way: WannaCry. In the incident war room, the tone is clipped and present tense. We're staring at process trees, watching a file called taskshe.exe spawn encryptors. We're tracing connections on port 445. Heat maps lighting up wherever Windows file sharing sits exposed. We're hearing the same three-step rhythm across networks: exploit, execute, encrypt. Outside the glass, executives walk the hallways with that haunted look that appears when an abstract risk has suddenly become a concrete emergency. And we keep hearing one detail, repeated with equal parts frustration and disbelief. A fix existed. A patch was available. But the worm didn't wait for perfect change windows or governance meetings. It saw the door in the protocol and walked right in. By nightfall on day one, a curious twist emerges. A young researcher examines the malware's code and notices an odd domain, nonsense letters strung together. On a hunch, he registers it. Across segments of the internet, the worm trips over an unexpected condition and stalls. An accidental kill switch slows the global spread, like someone discovering that flipping an obscure breaker stops the fire alarm from screaming. But the relief is partial and temporary. Variants begin to appear. Networks are already burning. And for many organizations, the question isn't whether the worm can be halted. It's how to rebuild from what's already been scorched. This is the story of WannaCry, a worm born at the intersection of intelligence-grade exploits and everyday neglect, detonating across an unprepared world, leaving behind encrypted data, canceled appointments, and a decade of security lessons paid for in cash, downtime, and trust. To understand WannaCry, you have to understand the asymmetrical power of old code meeting new incentives. Deep in the stack of a typical Windows network lies SMB, the server message block protocol that handles file and printer sharing. It's the invisible conveyor belt that moves documents, backups, and authentication handshakes. For decades, SMB has been a workhorse, evolved, extended, and tuned for performance. But like every old workhorse, some of its joints creak. Version 1, the earliest widely deployed flavor, carried design decisions and assumptions from a different age. It trusted the local network a little too much. It exposed too much of itself to the outside world. It was never designed for a planet of laptops that roam between coffee shops, branch offices, and home routers. That's the technical foundation. Now add a very human ingredient, the stockpiling of offensive cyber capabilities. Nations collect vulnerabilities and weaponize them. They do it to peer over fences, to sabotage when policy demands, or to keep options on the table in a game where the players are clever and the board is global. Over the years, one such vulnerability, later dubbed EternalBlue, got wrapped in professional-grade exploit code and paired with a post-exploitation implant known as double pulsar. In the right hands, this combination offered a terrifyingly reliable way to move through Windows networks that hadn't been patched. In the wrong hands, it offered the same. Here is the uncomfortable bridge. Patches are only useful when deployed, not when published. Microsoft shipped a critical update months before the outbreak, warning about remote code execution in SMB v1 and urging customers to fix it. But patching is not merely an act, it's a process. You inventory systems that shouldn't exist anymore but somehow still do. You negotiate change windows for servers that support brittle legacy applications. You test, you stage, you roll back when something breaks. And sometimes you hesitate because next week is the quarter close. Or that vendor will void our warranty if we modify the image. A single delay across thousands of endpoints becomes a giant attack surface measured in calendar excuses. Ransomware, meanwhile, evolved from a vandal's trick into an industry. Early strains were crude and sometimes reversible. But over time, the crooks learned to pair strong cryptography with the anonymity and liquidity of cryptocurrency. With a reliable exploit and a good worm, ransomware stops being a smash and grab and becomes an industrial accident you can trigger on demand. That's what set the stage in the spring of 2017. A professional exploit leaked to the world, an aging protocol widely exposed, a patch not yet universally applied, and adversaries ready to monetize chaos one locked workstation at a time. WannaCry's creators packaged those ingredients into something that behaved more like a contagion than a typical malware campaign. It did not need phishing to get its first foothold. It did not need social engineering to multiply. It exploited the structure of Windows networking itself, using the same doors admins use to manage boxes at scale. And by encrypting files with robust cryptography, it shifted the cost of neglect back onto the owners of the data, demanding payment not in morality, but in mathematics. You didn't need to like the attackers. You just needed the private key they promised to provide. The result was a perfect storm, a wormable ransomware that spread at machine speed, crossing countries and industries, not because its authors had singled out a target, but because the target was the world's unpatched Windows. Hospitals, factories, logistics firms, universities, governments, anyone with the wrong combination of exposure, timing, and misfortune found themselves part of the same incident even if they'd never heard each other's names. In a space that often feels abstract, WannaCry made cybersecurity painfully concrete. The first wave hits on May 12, 2017. Early reports surface in Europe where business hours turn on first. A major telecom in Spain reports internal systems shutting down. Almost immediately, the UK's National Health Service becomes the public face of the crisis. Screens in GP offices and hospitals are locked, and clinicians find themselves staring at the same pixelated countdown and Bitcoin demands as IT scrambles to isolate infected segments. Ambulances are diverted. Non-urgent procedures are postponed. Patients who have already traveled to appointments are told to return home because the scheduling software and electronic records can't be trusted. Within hours, pressure waves ripple outward. Germany's rail operator displays ransom notes on station monitors, a jarring visual that turns a cyber incident into a public spectacle. In France, automobile plants pause lines to prevent further spread. Across Russia, offices and government ministries report disruption. Universities in China feel the blast as students' lab machines go down. In the United States, shipping and delivery infrastructure records impact. The map does not fill in randomly. It follows the tendrils of exposed SMB and unpatched Windows 7, harvesting victims where the combination is ripe. As the day wears on, responders establish two streams of work. The first is tactical containment. Isolate infected machines, segment networks, block SMB traffic at boundaries, and push emergency rules to endpoint security tools to detect the ransomware binary, its mutexes, and its encryption behavior. The second is strategic triage. Identify crown jewels, prioritize systems that keep patients alive or goods moving, and make hard calls about shutting down whole subnets to protect the rest. Somewhere in between these streams floats the grim truth: the encryption is for real. There is no magic admin account to reverse it. Recovery will depend on backups, snapshots, and the cruel arithmetic of how many sensitive machines have none. Late that day, an unexpected inflection point appears. A researcher poring over the malware's dynamic behavior sees an odd pattern. The code tries to reach out to a long, unregistered domain name before it proceeds. This looks like a sandbox check, the kind of "are we being observed?" trick that stops execution if any network lookup returns a successful response. But the domain is unregistered, meaning the lookup will fail on the real internet. The researcher registers it on a hunch, turning those lookups into answers instead of failures. Suddenly, many instances of the worm, upon receiving a positive response from that domain, stop encrypting. It's as if someone has discovered a way to whisper to the malware, "You're being watched," and the malware chooses discretion over destruction. The so-called kill switch is not a cure. It does nothing for machines already encrypted. It does nothing for networks where egress is blocked and the lookup never succeeds. But it slows the outbreak and buys responders time. Over the weekend, new variants appear without the kill switch and the global game becomes whack-a-mole. Meanwhile, Microsoft publishes emergency guidance and for the first time in years, releases patches for out-of-support systems, Windows XP and Server 2003, because the incident has shown that unsupported does not mean unused. Organizations scramble to inventory exposure and apply the update originally released in March. Across the following days, the acute phase peaks and recedes, replaced by the grinding, unglamorous work of restoration. Encrypted endpoints get re-imaged. File servers roll back to last known good snapshots. Teams audit which backups were intact and which were quietly broken all along. Executives ask for answers. How many systems were affected? How did this get in? How fast can we promise it won't happen again? Meanwhile, incident responders and threat intel teams trace the Bitcoin wallets hard-coded in the malware, watching payments tick in and out, trying to understand whether victims are paying and whether anyone is actually receiving decryption keys in return. In the weeks that follow, attribution discussions mature. Code overlaps and infrastructure clues point toward a group long associated with the DPRK's Lazarus activity set. Public statements by governments and major vendors converge on the same conclusion. The worm's operators or code lineage connect to North Korean actors with a track record of both espionage and financially motivated intrusions. That determination matters less for immediate recovery than for understanding the strategic arc of cybercrime. A campaign that looked like a scattershot rent-seeking operation also carries the fingerprints of a state-linked group. The boundaries between nation-state capability and financially motivated malware look thinner than many hoped. Months later, another chapter quietly closes when the Bitcoin sitting in the 3 known wallets moves through mixers and tumbles into obscurity. The cycle is complete. Exploit turned worm, worm turned ransomware, ransom turned coin, coin turned noise. What remains are the bills, measured in canceled appointments, lost production hours, emergency patching weekends, and reputational damage, and a stack of after-action reports that will influence roadmaps for years. At its core, WannaCry is a 3-act play performed at machine speed. Act 1 is initial execution through a remote code execution hole in SMBv1. The malware scans networks for systems listening on port 445 and crafts exploit traffic that tickles a specific flaw in the way Windows handles SMB packets. The exploit, known as EternalBlue, leverages that flaw to gain kernel-level code execution without any authentication. No credentials are required. No user interaction is necessary. If SMBv1 is exposed and the system is unpatched, the door opens. Act 2 is payload installation and worming. Once code execution is achieved, the malware deploys itself, often leveraging a kernel-mode shellcode path to load an implant-like component, effectively achieving the same end state as a manual post-exploitation dropper such as Double Pulsar. The new foothold establishes persistence by installing services and setting up scheduled tasks, commonly under benign-sounding names that mask their true behavior. The worming logic kicks in immediately, enumerating local subnets and randomly selected external IP ranges, spraying exploit attempts outward. This is how WannaCry leapt across offices, campuses, and in some cases between organizations that shared poorly segmented network space. Act 3 is encryption and extortion. The ransomware component, often referenced as Wanna Decrypt Error 2.0 in on-screen displays, begins walking the file system. It targets a long list of file extensions that are likely to contain valuable data: documents, spreadsheets, images, archives, databases. For each file, it generates an AES session key and encrypts the content, then secures that session key with RSA public key cryptography so the victim cannot simply reverse it without access to the private key held by the attackers. The software alters file extensions, drops ransom notes in directories, changes the desktop wallpaper to a high-contrast threat, and displays a modal window with a countdown that ratchets up anxiety and the ransom price over time. 2 aspects of WannaCry's design deserve special attention. The first is the kill switch mechanism. Somewhere early in execution, the malware performs an HTTP request to a pre-baked domain name that does not exist at compile time. If the request succeeds, if the domain resolves and returns a page, the malware interprets this as a signal not to proceed. The most plausible theory is that the authors intended this as an anti-analysis trick, based on how some malware sandboxes respond to any domain lookup with a yes. Ironically, registering the domain on the live internet made large swaths of the infection base look like a sandbox from the malware's point of view, and the malware dutifully stood down. But the mechanism's simplicity also meant copycats could strip it out, and in fragmented networks the lookup failed anyway. The second is the cryptography's seriousness and its quirks. This was not a toy cipher. The use of a hybrid scheme, fast symmetric encryption for bulk data and asymmetric encryption to secure keys, follows the same pattern as legitimate secure systems. Under normal circumstances, without the private key corresponding to the public key embedded in the malware, decryption would be computationally infeasible. However, responders discovered that on some Windows versions, specifically older builds where cryptographic key material remained in memory, tools could sometimes extract the prime numbers used to generate the RSA keys if the machine had not been rebooted and memory had not been reused. Utilities surfaced that could in very limited cases recover files by reconstructing keys from RAM. This was not a universal salvation. It worked only under narrow conditions, and for most victims without recent backups the choice remained bleak. Propagation strategies within networks combined opportunism and raw speed. The worm's scanner did not need to be subtle. Every reachable machine was a potential target. In flat networks where segmentation was not enforced and SMB was broadly open, a single infected workstation could become a super spreader. The presence of legacy systems, embedded devices, diagnostic machines in hospitals, industrial control workstations, amplified the effect because those devices were left on, often poorly maintained, and frequently endowed with exactly the unsafe SMB exposure the worm needed. Over perimeter boundaries, the worm's reach depended on how organizations treated port 445. Where that port was exposed to the internet, WannaCry found it. Where it was blocked at the firewall, the worm had to hitch rides on VPNs or jump through misconfigurations. On the defensive side, the technical playbook hardened quickly. Network intrusion detection rules keyed off the EternalBlue exploit's distinctive signature. Endpoint tools learned to spot the ransomware's binary hashes, mutex names, and file creation patterns. Emergency scripts enumerated machines that lacked the critical patch. Administrators disabled SMBv1 en masse, sometimes discovering only then which dusty applications broke without it. Microsoft's emergency updates for unsupported systems lowered the barrier for the most stubborn pockets of risk, and incident responders learned to check for the presence of the kill switch domain, tuning egress and DNS to let those lookups succeed as one of several triage measures. In short, WannaCry's technical achievement wasn't novelty, it was integration. It took known ideas, a wormable network exploit, a fast replication strategy, strong crypto for leverage, and welded them into a tool chain that required no human help to spread and no subtlety to monetize. It didn't spearfish your CFO. It didn't guess a password. It simply asked a question of your network: have you kept up? The human impact lands hardest in healthcare. In the UK, hospitals and clinics cancel thousands of appointments. Non-urgent surgeries are rescheduled. Ambulances divert to facilities still operating normally. Staff revert to paper charts, whiteboards, and phone calls. The machinery of modern healthcare, scanners, blood analyzers, imaging systems, relies on a web of Windows endpoints and servers that were never designed for sudden isolation. Clinicians experience one of cybersecurity's most sobering truths. Downtime is not a theoretical risk, it is a patient risk. The financial cost is measurable, but the trust cost, patients wondering why their hospital couldn't protect itself, lingers far longer. Manufacturing takes a different flavor of blow. Assembly lines stop because the sequencing systems that coordinate parts and robots can't read their config files. Industrial engineers, long accustomed to planning maintenance months in advance, face the unplanned reality of risky stops. Some plants shut down proactively to keep the worm from locking up controllers. The irony is hard to miss. Ransomware supposedly about data turns out to be about motion. Doors not opening, belts not turning, cranes not lifting because the instructions for doing so are trapped in a lockbox someone else controls. Transportation and logistics feel the ripple too. Digital signage goes down in rail stations, producing the surreal sight of ransom notes presented to commuters, as if someone hacked the loudspeakers. Warehouses delay shipments because inventory systems can't reconcile inbound and outbound loads. Customer support centers queue for hours because ticketing systems are unreliable. In government offices, the effect is bureaucratic but real. Citizens can't file forms, get permits, or receive services on time. The machine that keeps modern states running sputters when its file shares choke. Insurance companies start counting. Forensic firms tally impacts across clients. The conversation shifts from "are we protected?" to "how much did this cost?" measured in overtime, lost revenue, emergency procurements, and cascading delays. Some organizations confront an embarrassing discovery. Their backups were untested or incomplete. They thought they had a safety net only to find it was full of holes. Others learn a different lesson. Restoration takes time even when you have good backups, and that time is its own cost. You can't simply push a button labeled "undo." Public policy enters the scene as well. The incident fuels debate about the stewardship of vulnerabilities by intelligence agencies. When professional-grade exploits leak and get used at scale against civilians, the question isn't just technical, it's ethical and strategic. Software vendors call for a digital Geneva Convention, a metaphor meant to capture the idea that hoarding 0 days for offense has unintended consequences for everyone else. Governments insist that stockpiling is necessary, that trade-offs are managed, that the benefits outweigh the risks. WannaCry gives both sides fresh evidence and sharper arguments. Attribution adds a geopolitical dimension. Statements by multiple governments pointing to North Korean-linked actors transform the narrative from crime wave to state-linked extortion at internet scale. For defenders inside companies, that distinction doesn't change triage, but it does affect boardrooms and budgets. When a single worm can cross the globe and kneecap critical services, the argument for spending on patch management, segmentation, and security architecture stops being abstract. WannaCry becomes the go-to slide in budget meetings for a reason. Perhaps the subtlest fallout is cultural. IT teams that had warned for years about legacy systems suddenly find themselves with leverage. C-suites that tolerated technical debt because it facilitated business as usual now understand that the debt accrues interest in the currency of downtime. Risk registers get rewritten. Phrases like SMBV1 and EternalBlue become shorthand for an entire category of problem. Critical vulnerabilities in foundational protocols that are easy to ignore until they bite. And within security teams, the after-action reports become case studies for future training. Not just what went wrong, but how to move quickly when wrong becomes real. WannaCry did not invent wormable ransomware, but it industrialized it for a mass audience of defenders and attackers alike. In its wake, we see two diverging paths. On the positive path, organizations accelerate the retirement of ancient protocols and applications. SMBV1 falls out of favor, disabled by default in newer Windows builds and eradicated through hardening campaigns. Patch pipelines evolve from manual ad hoc exercises into continuous programs with real inventory, real SLOs, and real accountability. Network architectures tighten, segmenting critical systems and removing gratuitous trust. The language of assume breach moves from conference talk to design requirements. On the negative path, adversaries learn that stockpiled exploits and path of least resistance worms produce windfalls. They take notes on the human response. They craft follow-on campaigns that combine network propagation with more targeted sabotage, blending the fast spread of a worm with the precision of a hands-on keyboard intruder. They refine their payment operations, reducing traceable choke points and improving their customer service so victims feel more confident paying. They watch defenders celebrate a lucky kill switch and resolve to avoid such simple mistakes next time. Supply chains emerge as a frontier. The same economics that make SMB attractive, shared resources, centralized services, easy discovery, apply to software components and managed services. The future battlefield includes not just your endpoints but your vendors' updates, your partners' remote access, your cloud storage buckets, and the subcontractors 3 layers down who maintain your specialized equipment. The lesson isn't paranoia, it's scope. Your risk perimeter is bigger than your office and lasts longer than the warranty on your servers. Governance and regulation lag, then catch up. Critical infrastructure sectors face new guidance and, in some jurisdictions, mandatory reporting. Healthcare systems formalize downgrade plans for electronic records. Manufacturers treat cyber risk as a safety issue with real hazard analyses. Boards ask pointed questions. How many unsupported systems do we still run? How quickly can we patch critical vulnerabilities? How do we verify that segmentation actually segments? Insurance underwriters get more technical, requiring controls beyond checkbox attestations. Technically, the trend lines are clear. Automated exploitation at scale will remain attractive as long as organizations maintain heterogeneous, partially managed fleets. The defensive countertrend: managed endpoint detection, robust identity controls, zero-trust networking, can blunt attacks that rely on lateral movement, but none of those controls patch a kernel. The basics matter, backups matter, and so does the speed at which you can restore them. Egress matters, not in the sense of perfect prevention, but in making it hard for malware to reach command and control or perform quirky domain checks in ways you can't monitor. Asset inventory matters because you cannot patch a machine you don't know you own. There is also a civic component. The question of how states handle vulnerabilities and tools will not go away. Neither will the economic incentives for criminals to use those tools once they leak. Responsible disclosure processes, vulnerability equities frameworks, and international norms are not silver bullets, but they are part of the ecosystem that determines how often we set the conditions for a WannaCry scale event. If the internet is infrastructure, then the stewardship of its cracks is a policy question as much as a technical one. Finally, there is a mindset shift for defenders that WannaCry accelerates. The shift is from preventing every incident to limiting blast radius, from trusting local networks to verifying every path, from treating patching as a chore to treating it as a first-line control deserving automation, metrics, and executive interest, from believing that emergency responses are exceptions to recognizing that they are predictable and therefore plannable. The question isn't whether another worm will try, it's whether your architecture assumes you can outrun it, or whether it's built so the worm runs out of room. We step out of the incident room and the building feels oddly quiet. The spike of adrenaline has passed, replaced by the long, careful work of restoration and reflection. Some systems are back, others will take days. In the hallway, a clinician asks a passing engineer, "Will this happen again?" The engineer pauses because the honest answer is that something like it will, and the only meaningful response is, "We'll be better prepared." WannaCry is not folklore. It is a ledger entry in modern operational risk. It proved that the chain from vulnerability to exploit, to weapon to worm to ransom, can be traversed in a single sprint by adversaries who understand both code and incentives. It proved that the blast radius of a cyber incident is measured not only in bytes but in business outcomes: canceled surgeries, halted production, delayed trains, and anxious customers. It proved that patches wait for nobody and that "we'll schedule it next quarter" is not a shield against the physics of the internet. But WannaCry also gave us a blueprint. It taught us that architecture beats improvisation, that segmentation and least privilege turn a wildfire into a burn scar, that asset inventories and patch SLAs are not compliance trivia, but operational lifelines, that backups are only real if you can restore them in anger, that disabling obsolete protocols is not an upgrade task but a safety measure, that egress, DNS, and network policy are as much defensive tools as antivirus alerts. There's another blueprint too, the one for humility. An anonymous researcher registering a nonsense domain should not be our disaster plan, but it is a reminder that defenses fail and luck sometimes fills gaps we didn't know we had. The right response to that luck is not complacency. It's gratitude followed by the hard work of making luck less necessary next time. It is the refusal to let an emergency drift back into the comfort of normal, until we have turned lessons into changes and changes into habits. So here is the call to action. Walk your environment the way WannaCry did. Don't start at the polished dashboards. Start at the old protocols, the forgotten servers, the lab machines that never made it into the CMDB. Close the doors you don't need. Patch the ones you do. Interrogate your backup drills until you believe them with the same conviction you bring to your revenue forecasts. Make your network small on the inside and inhospitable to movement, and then write it down, test it, and hold yourselves to it when the calendar gets crowded and the pressure to defer the unglamorous work comes calling. Because the next worm will not care about your change freeze. It will not skip the machines you meant to replace last year. It will not be impressed by your mission statement. It will do exactly what WannaCry did. Pour itself into the seams of a complex system and lock up what matters until you either pay, rebuild, or prove you learned something. Our job is to make sure that when it comes, It finds us in a different place than we were on that Friday in May. Not perfect, not invulnerable, but prepared, with fewer seams, smaller blast radii, and a practiced, unflinching playbook that turns panic into process. That is the promise we owe to the clinicians who had to cancel a patient's surgery, to the operators who hit the emergency stop, to the commuters who stared at a ransom note instead of a schedule, and to the teams who worked through a weekend patching under pressure. WannaCry was a lesson written in red and black across millions of screens. Our answer isn't a slogan. It's the unglamorous, continuous work of building systems that can take a hit and keep doing the thing they were built to do.